In late February 2026, war reached the most important energy choke point on Earth. Tankers began disappearing from the Strait of Hormuz. Gulf ports became inaccessible. Oil fields reduced production because storage tanks were filling faster than ships could empty them. Airlines rewrote schedules, governments opened emergency reserves, and economists began discussing the number that always appears when the oil market wants to frighten everyone before breakfast: $200 a barrel. At its worst, as much as 14 million barrels per Dalton Y disappeared from normal global supply. The disruption became larger than the Arab oil embargo, the Iranian Revolution, the Gulf War, and the shock that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And yet the global economy did not collapse. Prices rose, flights became more expensive, companies delayed projects, and growth slowed. But the global economic machine kept operating. Brent crude climbed from around $70 before the conflict to a peak near $126. Painful, certainly, but still below early forecasts of $150 or even $200. So what happened? This is the story of the largest oil shock in history, the emergency system that absorbed it, and the uncomfortable reason why surviving the crisis may have made the next one more dangerous. The world did not discover that it no longer needs oil. It discovered that it had built a very expensive insurance policy and then used a large part of it in only a few months. To understand the crisis, we need to begin with geography. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. At its narrowest point, it is only about 21 miles or 34 kilometers. Across, the actual shipping lanes are much narrower, 2 lanes, each only a few miles wide, separated by a buffer zone. Behind that narrow entrance sit several of the world's largest energy exporters. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iran all depend heavily on the strait. Before the war, around 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products crossed it every day. That represented roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption and more than 1/4 of seaborne oil trade. Around 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas trade also passed through Hormuz, much of it from Qatar. Unlike oil, which can sometimes be redirected through pipelines, Qatar's LNG had almost no practical large-scale alternative route. The same corridor also carried ammonia, sulfur, urea, and other fertilizer materials. Nobody makes an action movie about delayed ammonia cargoes. Farmers still notice when they do not arrive. Hormuz is not important because it contains oil. It is important because an enormous amount of oil has almost nowhere else to go. Saudi Arabia and the UAE do have pipelines that bypass the strait, leading to Red Sea ports and Fujairah. But their combined available capacity could handle only a fraction of normal Hormuz traffic. Imagine 20 people trying to leave through one main gate, while the emergency exit can handle 4 or 5. The emergency exit helps. It does not make the main gate optional. That was the weakness behind the crisis. Not a shortage of oil underground, but a shortage of ways to move it above ground. The war began on the 28th of February, when the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran. The full political and military background could fill several videos and start an argument in the comments. Before minute 5, what matters here is how the conflict reached the physical oil market. Iran responded by restricting traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Some ships were threatened or intercepted. Insurance premiums surged. Crews became reluctant to enter. Trading companies suspended voyages, and naval activity made every journey harder to plan. This is why describing the strait as simply open or closed can be misleading. A waterway does not need a giant chain across the sea. It only needs to become dangerous, uninsurable, or commercially irrational. A tanker may technically be able to sail through. But if the insurer refuses coverage, the crew refuses the voyage, and the owner thinks the ship could become a floating geopolitical bargaining chip, the tanker is not going anywhere. Iran did not need to destroy every ship. It only needed to make entering the strait look like a terrible business decision. Shipping through Hormuz fell by roughly 97% during the early phase of the conflict. Some vessels continued with escorts or special permissions, but normal commercial traffic had effectively collapsed. Oil still existed in Gulf storage tanks. Wells were still capable of producing it. Buyers still wanted it, yet economically, much of that oil had disappeared. Supply is not only what exists, supply is what can be loaded, insured, financed, transported, and delivered. A barrel trapped behind a closed export route is a barrel the global market cannot use. Before the conflict, close to 20 million barrels per Dalton Y moved through Hormuz. During the worst stage of the crisis, average flows fell to roughly 2.7 million barrels per Dalton Y. At the peak, the disruption removed as much as 14 million barrels per Dalton Y from normal supply. By June, cumulative losses had exceeded 1.3 billion barrels. The market lost that volume cargo after cargo, day after day, until a temporary emergency became a giant hole in global supply. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE all reduced output. Iran's own exports were disrupted as well. The IEA estimated that at least 8 million barrels per Dalton Y of crude production had initially been curtailed, along with another 2 million barrels per Dalton Y of condensates and natural gas liquids. Why shut production when the oil is still valuable? Because oil fields are not magical taps connected directly to the world economy, crude moves from wells into pipelines, storage tanks, export terminals, and tankers. When the tanker does not arrive, the terminal fills. When the terminal fills, the pipeline backs up. When the pipeline backs up, producers reduce output at the field. The problem moves backwards. Ship-port pipeline. Well, LNG exports collapsed as well. Qatar is one of the world's largest LNG exporters, especially to Asia. When its cargoes could not reliably leave the Gulf gas markets tightened thousands of kilometers from the fighting. The war therefore removed more than crude oil. It removed LNG refined products, petrochemical feedstocks, and confidence that future cargoes would arrive on schedule. Energy markets sell physical fuel, but they also sell confidence about next month. In early 2026, both disappeared together. Oil never remains inside the oil market. It enters airline tickets, plastic packaging, fertilizer, delivery trucks, electricity bills, and eventually the price of dinner. The first visible impact came through transport. Jet fuel prices rose sharply because refining and distribution systems were also under pressure. Airlines faced more expensive fuel, closed airspace, longer routes, and uncertain passenger demand. When a flight avoids a conflict zone, it burns more expensive fuel. Aviation had accidentally invented a cost multiplier, which shareholders rarely celebrate. Shipping faced the same problem. War risk insurance premiums and freight rates surged. Some vessels sailed longer routes. Others waited offshore. Every delay tied up a ship that could have been carrying another cargo. Longer diversions meant more fuel, more crew time, and fewer available vessels. A route that had once been routine suddenly required military assessments, insurance negotiations, and a very nervous captain. The shock reached food. Natural gas is a major input in producing ammonia, which is used for nitrogen fertilizer. The Gulf is also a large exporter of ammonia and urea. Disruptions therefore raised both the cost of making fertilizer and the cost of transporting it. Farmers paid more for diesel, chemicals, and freight. In poorer countries, that could mean using less fertilizer, producing a smaller harvest, and facing higher food prices months later. The war might happen in February, but the supermarket receipt could arrive in autumn. Economic consequences are thoughtful like that. They wait until everyone has stopped paying attention. Industry was hit as well. Petrochemicals are used in plastics, paint, cosmetics, packaging, synthetic fibers, and thousands of manufacturing inputs. Companies had to decide whether the price surge was temporary or permanent. By May, global companies had reported more than $25 billion in conflict. Related costs, including approximately $15 billion in additional airline fuel expenses. Manufacturers delayed investment, changed suppliers, added surcharges, and withdrew forecasts because planning had become an elaborate form of guessing while wearing a tie. The crisis also reached central banks. Higher energy prices raise inflation, but they also weaken growth by reducing household spending and business investment. Policymakers had to choose between fighting inflation and supporting the economy. Raise interest rates too aggressively and growth slows further. Cut rates too soon and energy inflation can spread through wages and services. In other words, the policy choice was whether they preferred the kitchen on fire or the living room flooded. So why did the global economy not collapse? The first answer is emergency oil reserves. The members of the International Energy Agency coordinated the largest emergency stock release in the organization's history. Hundreds of millions of barrels were made available from strategic reserves. The release did not replace every lost barrel. Nothing could, but it bought time. Time for refineries to find different crude grades. Time for traders to move stored oil closer to consumers. Time for alternative producers to raise output. Time for governments to introduce conservation measures and temporary support. Saudi Arabia redirected crude through its East West pipeline to Red Sea terminals. The UAE increased flows through its pipeline to Fujairah outside Hormuz. Together, the available bypass systems could reroute several million barrels per Dalton Y. That was crucial, but still far below the volume normally crossing Hormuz. The United States released strategic stocks and increased production where possible. Refineries changed crude grades and sourcing arrangements. Governments reduced fuel taxes, offered subsidies, restricted exports, or encouraged conservation. Refineries also adapted in ways that sound simple until you remember that crude oils are not identical. A refinery designed for one mixture cannot instantly process anything available. Different crude grades contain different levels of sulfur and have different densities. Switching supply can reduce efficiency, require new blending, and change the mix of fuels produced. But during the crisis, operators accepted those costs to keep fuel moving. Global energy security was partly protected by engineers making slightly ugly compromises at 3 in the morning. The important limitation is simple. Emergency reserves do not create new oil. They move consumption from the future into the present. A stock release is like using bottled water during a broken pipeline. It is exactly what the bottles are for, but once you drink them, they are empty, and the pipeline still needs repairing. The world did not solve the shortage. It spread the shortage across time. The second major reason prices did not reach $200 was China. China is the world's largest crude importer. In a supply crisis, the behavior of the largest buyer matters almost as much as the behavior of the largest producers. The frightening scenario was obvious. Gulf exports collapse. China competes aggressively for every available barrel. Europe and Asia bid against each other, and prices rise until somebody is forced to stop buying. But China did something different. It bought less. Before the conflict, Chinese crude imports were running at around 12 million barrels per Dalton Y. By June, imports had reportedly fallen to roughly 7 million barrels per Dalton Y refinery. Activity slowed sharply. Refined fuel exports were restricted to protect domestic supply. Commercial inventories were drawn down. Some petrochemical and infrastructure activity was delayed. Weaker economic demand also reduced the need for fuel. Electric vehicles played a supporting role. China's enormous EV fleet did not eliminate oil demand, but it reduced petrol consumption in a normal year. That is an energy transition statistic. During a supply crisis, it becomes a strategic buffer. The world's largest oil buyer absorbed part of the shock by reducing demand instead of bidding prices upward. This does not mean China acted out of international generosity. Governments rarely stabilize commodity markets for the emotional well-being of foreign motorists. Beijing was protecting its own economy and avoiding purchases at extreme prices, but the global effect was the same. Every barrel China did not buy reduced pressure on the market, while every electric car quietly reduced imported fuel demand. China also held large inventories, although their exact use remained opaque. The most important buyer in the market responded to scarcity by stepping away from the auction. That removed one of the forces that could have pushed Brent toward $200. The third explanation is that the global economy of 2026 is not the global economy of 1973. During the Arab oil embargo, advanced economies used far more oil for every dollar of output. Cars were less efficient. Buildings consumed more energy. Heavy industry represented a larger share of production. Supply was more concentrated. Strategic reserves were smaller, and governments had less experience coordinating emergency responses. Today, the world still depends heavily on oil, but it uses oil more efficiently. Advanced economies are more service-oriented. Vehicles travel farther per liter. Buildings use better insulation. Industrial processes have improved. Electricity generation relies more on natural gas, nuclear power, and renewables. Oil supply is also more geographically diverse. The United States is now one of the world's largest producers, while Brazil, Canada, and Guyana have expanded. They cannot replace the Gulf overnight, but supply is less concentrated. Strategic reserves are far larger than in the 1970s. Futures markets allow airlines, refiners, and manufacturers to hedge part of their price risk. Global trading networks can redirect cargoes at a speed that would have looked like sorcery to an oil trader using a telephone and paper map in 1973. There is also more substitution. Electric vehicles reduce petrol demand. Natural gas and renewable power reduce oil burning and electricity. Nuclear plants provide stable generation without crude. Remote work can reduce commuting when prices rise, although another video meeting may not feel like progress. But the difference must not be exaggerated. The modern economy is less oil-intensive. It is not oil-independent. Aircraft still need jet fuel. Ships and heavy trucks rely heavily on petroleum. Agriculture depends on diesel, gas, and petrochemicals. Plastics and chemicals are embedded throughout manufacturing. The 2026 crisis was not another 1973 because the world had more suppliers, more storage, better efficiency, and more institutional memory. It had learned from previous shocks. Unfortunately, learning from history does not mean graduating from history. By the middle of the crisis, the oil market began rebuilding itself around the disruption. Saudi crude moved toward Red Sea terminals. Emirati exports increased through Fujairah. Some cargoes sailed around Africa. Buyers switched crude grades. Traders drew on oil stored near consuming markets. Producers in the Americas supplied additional barrels where they could. Iraq experimented with overland alternatives through Turkey and other regional routes. These solutions were inefficient, expensive, and occasionally slightly absurd. Moving oil by truck across borders is not how anyone would design a global energy system from scratch, but global markets are rarely designed from scratch. They are repaired during emergencies using whatever still works. Companies accepted higher logistics costs rather than stopping completely. Refineries bought less suitable crude, ships sailed farther, and traders combined smaller cargoes. Together, these imperfect solutions prevented an absolute shortage. This helps explain one of the strangest features of the crisis. Brent fell sharply from its peak even while Hormuz remained heavily restricted. Prices were not necessarily predicting peace, they were pricing adaptation. Once traders believed that reserves, lower Chinese demand, alternative pipelines, new routes, and non-Gulf production could cover enough of the gap, the price needed to destroy demand became lower. The oil market did not solve the disruption. It rebuilt itself around the disruption that adaptation still carried costs. Longer routes used more fuel and more ships. Inventories ran down. Pipelines operated closer to capacity. Lower demand partly reflected canceled investment and weaker growth. A falling oil price can mean supply has recovered. Or it can mean the economy has become poorer, more efficient, more inventive, and more desperate at the same time. In 2026, it meant a little of all four global averages made the crisis look manageable. But global averages do not buy fuel, fertilizer, or food. People and governments do, and their ability to absorb the shock was radically unequal. Wealthy governments could release reserves or subsidize energy. Large companies could hedge prices and borrow. Rich households could complain about expensive petrol and continue driving poorer oil. Importing countries had much less protection. Their currencies often weakened against the dollar, which made dollar-priced oil even more expensive. Governments with high debt had little fiscal space for subsidies. Central banks faced the worst possible combination: higher inflation, weaker growth, and pressure on the currency. Raising interest rates could protect the currency but damage jobs and investment. Keeping rates low could make imported inflation worse. The human consequences were simple. A taxi driver could no longer afford a full tank. A farmer paid more for fertilizer, diesel, and transport. A small factory faced higher electricity costs or temporary power cuts. A family cut travel, meat, or medicine to pay for food and fuel. None of these people cared whether the global economy had technically avoided recession. Their personal economy had already entered one. Food. Importing countries faced a double shock. Energy prices increased transport and production costs, while fertilizer shortages threatened future harvests. Airlines in emerging markets struggled with higher jet fuel costs and weaker currencies. Small manufacturers could not negotiate the same contracts as multinational companies. For them, the difference between oil at $70 and oil at $120 was not an interesting chart. It was whether the business stayed open. The World Bank warned that a prolonged escalation could cut global growth sharply while increasing inflation. Highly indebted and lower-income economies faced the greatest danger. This is one reason global resilience can be misleading. The system can survive while millions of people become poorer. A bridge has not truly passed the test if the center remains standing while the weaker edges collapse. Then oil prices began to fall. Gasoline shortages were less severe than feared. Governments pointed to resilience. Investors decided the worst had passed. And to some extent, they were right. The emergency response had prevented the immediate disaster. Alternative supply had grown. Demand had weakened. Physical markets had adapted. But the calm was deceptive. Strategic reserves had been depleted. Commercial inventories were lower. Infrastructure damage required time to repair. Some pipelines had operated near their limits. Ships had been redirected, and the cheapest routes remained unavailable. Emergency stocks would eventually need to be rebuilt, which meant future demand for oil. The system had survived partly by consuming its safety cushion. The world survived by using the insurance policy that is different from proving the house was never on fire. If another major disruption had occurred immediately, immediately, governments would have started with fewer reserves and companies with less inventory. A second shock would not have met the same system that faced the first. It would have met a system already tired, partially repaired, and missing some of its spare parts. This matters because energy security is not only about whether supply exists today, it is about how much flexibility remains when tomorrow goes wrong. Before the conflict, the global market had spare capacity, strategic stocks, commercial inventories, and alternative routes. By summer, many of those buffers were smaller. The headline price had fallen, but the margin for error had fallen with it. July delivered that warning. Renewed fighting reduced tanker traffic again. Houthi attacks threatened Red Sea routes that had become more important precisely because Hormuz was restricted. Brent moved from roughly $70 to above $100 during the month before falling sharply, after a temporary pause in strikes. Shipping through Hormuz remained only a fraction of pre-war levels. The market became extraordinarily sensitive to diplomatic language. A statement about negotiations could remove several dollars from the oil price. A report of another attack could add them back. Traders studied every press conference as if one adjective might reopen a shipping lane or close another one. Financial markets have always had a special talent for turning punctuation into billions of dollars. This volatility showed that the problem had not been solved. Prices were moving on expectations about access, not on a full restoration of normal supply. The market was calm only when it believed the next interruption would not happen immediately. Every new attack tested that belief. The Iran war therefore proved two apparently contradictory things. First, the global energy system is more resilient than it was 50 years ago. It has strategic reserves, alternative pipelines, flexible producers, electric vehicles, sophisticated trading networks, and governments capable of coordinating an emergency response. It can redirect cargoes, reduce demand, and keep refineries operating through a historic disruption. Second, the system is more interconnected than ever. A blocked waterway can reach a fertilizer plant, an airline, a central bank, and a family grocery bill within weeks. Efficiency makes the world richer, but it can also make inventories thinner and supply chains more tightly connected. A system designed to avoid waste may discover during a crisis that some of what looked like waste was actually resilience. The world survived the largest oil shock in history because it had spent decades building buffers. It released those buffers, redirected trade, increased production elsewhere, and reduced demand. China bought less refineries improvised. Governments subsidized fuel. Consumers changed behavior. Companies accepted higher costs instead of shutting down. None of that was free. The cost appeared in public debt, depleted reserves, weaker growth, higher food prices, canceled investment, and lower living standards. The absence of collapse did not mean the absence of damage. It meant the damage was distributed across countries, companies, and time. That may be the most important lesson. Modern economic systems rarely fail. Like a light being switched off, they bend, they reroute, they borrow from the future. They protect the strongest users first and pass costs toward the weakest. From a distance, this can look like resilience. Up close, it often looks like somebody paying more for dinner. The question is no longer why the first shock failed to break the economy. We know the answer. The world had reserves, alternative routes, flexible supply, and enough demand reduction to survive. The real question is whether the system can absorb another shock before it has rebuilt what it used to survive this one. The Strait of Hormuz reopened just enough for the world to breathe. It did not reopen enough for the world to relax.